Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever you may be tuning in from. I'm Michael Kimmage, the director of the Kennan Institute, and I'm delighted to introduce this event today. I'm joined as a co-moderator by my colleague Jennifer Wistrand, the deputy director of the Kennan Institute, and we're both delighted to be hosting two very distinguished speakers today. And this is Eddie Fishman, Senior Research Scholar at Columbia University and author of, I think, the very soon to be published book, Choke Points, American Power in the Age of Economic Warfare. So welcome, Eddie. We are also joined by Will Ruger, the president of the American Institute for Economic Research and a veteran of the war in Afghanistan. And I'll just briefly outline the structure of today's conversation, say a few things about the Kennan Institute and about how our audience can tune in with questions of its own, and then we will dive right in. We are going to be talking about the animating ideas over the course of the last couple of years, and we'll be charting the animating ideas, particularly as they concern economic statecraft, vis-a-vis Russia and Ukraine, but we may range a bit more widely than that. We'll start with the Biden administration. We'll proceed to the Trump administration, which is, of course, only a couple of weeks in. So that's, sort of more of a work in progress to analyze. And we will be concerned throughout, not just with discontinuities, which is, of course, the journalistic story of the last couple of months, but also with continuities actual and potential as we, sort of sketch out the larger picture. Let me urge our audience to visit the Kennan Institute's website, and if so inclined, to sign up for the Kennan Institute newsletter, which gives information on our publications, blogs, podcasts, etc. And for those who have questions that they're eager to ask, you can please put them into the Q&A function, and we will be sure to have a good 10-15 minutes at the end of this conversation for the audience to join in. So that by way of introduction. Once again, welcome, Will and Eddie. Really delighted that you can be here with us virtually. And let me start with a question. I'll start with Eddie and then go to Will. If in the biggest picture sense, you could indicate, Eddie, what you think the aims were of economic statecraft in the Biden administration, really as it concerns the war in Ukraine, and a bit beyond the aims, what the key tools and mechanisms were. So we're not focusing primarily on military aid to Ukraine, but the economic side of the equation.
Sure. Well, Michael, thank you so much for having me here today for this discussion, and congratulations on your new role at the Kennan Institute. Excited to collaborate. So I think it's helpful maybe to start chronologically. When Biden came into office, there was I think a large consensus within his foreign policy team that the Trump administration, the first Trump administration, had allowed Russia to do a number of things that violated American national security interests without really responding. And so pretty early in the Biden administration, in April of 2021, President Biden signed an executive order that imposed new sanctions on Russia, including cutting Russia off from sovereign debt markets in the United States. And that was sort of seen as, a move to symbolize to Putin that there would be economic pain that he would suffer if he were to do things that violated American national security interests, to try to maybe reestablish a level of deterrence in U.S.-Russian relations. But I think also, an effort to potentially sort of put Russia on the shelf to a certain extent. The idea was a stable and predictable relationship at first, so that Biden could focus on more important issues like COVID, climate change, and China. Of course, history has a way of changing American presidents' foreign policy priorities. And in the summer and early fall of 2021 was when we really first started seeing significant concerns that Russia might be gearing up to invade Ukraine. And so what Biden's team did at that point was, they said, well, look, we have this early warning. We may be able to have some time to potentially change Putin's mind and maybe persuade him that it's not worth invading Ukraine. And this is pretty rare when it comes to, crises, and particularly when you have the use of sanctions or military force involved. Oftentimes it's a surprise, right? That's when Michael and I were in government, when Russia annexed Crimea in 2014. That was a surprise, right? So it wasn't like there was 5 months of preparation with sanctions ready to go. This time, U.S. intelligence kind of caught Putin dead to rights. And so what Biden tried to do was sort of at a technical level and sort of the level of policy level to create sanctions options within the U.S. government and with the European Union that could be deployed very quickly in the event that Putin invaded. And then at the same time, a high-level messaging strategy threatening Putin with swift and severe consequences, and particularly economic consequences, because I think pretty early on, it was military force was taken off the table because no one wanted a direct military confrontation between the U.S. and Russia, hoping that basically economic pain could be a deterrent. And we never really, economic deterrence is something that's been talked about, but this is like a unique test case because you have a sort of foreseeable crisis, time leading up to it, and a concerted presidential level messaging strategy backed by sort of actual bureaucratic planning for sanctions, both in Washington, Brussels, and other key capitals around the world. And what happened basically during that process, and something I talk about in my book, is they had to figure out what swift and severe consequences meant. And the challenge, I think, for the Biden administration was Russia is a very large oil producer. It's the largest fossil fuel exporter in the world, combined oil and gas. And inflation was a real problem in the US. And so they had to try to figure out how to make good on Biden's threat of swift and severe consequences without spiking oil prices and worsening inflation. And so this was really the challenge that American, European, other G7 policymakers were working on in sort of December, January, February. And what they came up with was really a twofold plan. One, sort of a hammer blow on the Russian financial system. So sanctions on the biggest banks in Russia, like Sberbank and VTB, ultimately freezing the assets of the Central Bank of Russia, which was, I think, seen as a pretty dramatic step when it happened in late February 2022, and cutting Russian banks off from SWIFT. And then on the other side was technology. It was trying to ban Russia from access to things like semiconductors from the West that could be used to help Putin's war effort. But largely, they kind of excluded energy. And in fact, they had a general license called General License 8, which carved out payments for Russian energy from the financial sanctions. So even though Sberbank, for instance, was cut off from transactions with American banks, you theoretically could pay Sberbank for oil or gas, which was a big exception. And I think what we saw, Michael, was, first of all, the threat of swift and severe consequences did not work as a deterrent. So Putin invaded Ukraine anyway. And so I think a very important question for historians, when they'll probably be debated for decades, is was that because Putin could have never been deterred by economic means alone? Is it because the threat wasn't credible enough? Certainly, there's good evidence that Putin underestimated the threat coming from the West, given that he did leave $300 billion worth of his foreign exchange reserves exposed to Western sanctions. And you would think that if they fully had expected the G7 to impose sanctions on the Russian central bank, maybe they would have gone much further in terms of diversifying into RMB or gold or other financial instruments. So I do think Putin underestimated the sanctions. Whether or not that would have changed his mind, I think we will never know. But basically what happened then is after the invasion, the West strategy pivoted pretty quickly to what I call economic attrition. It was no longer really a behavioralist calculus. It was no longer trying to get Putin to change his mind on Ukraine. It was really trying to weaken Russia's military-industrial complex and try to sort of shorten the amount of time that Putin could fight the war. And then, of course, the military assistance to Ukraine was just an attempt to lengthen the amount of time that Ukraine could fight the war. Finally, and then I want to give Will a chance to weigh in too, is over time, while I think initially there was a significant shock to Russia's economy in spring and summer of 2022, I think over time it became quite clear that there was a ceiling to how tough these sanctions could be if you weren't going to touch energy. So eventually we got a price cap on Russian oil, which went into effect in December of 2022, which also was kind of crafted to be very what I would call limited and somewhat cautious for fear of spiking oil prices. That also kind of had a similar trajectory to the sanctions of February, March, which is, they had a pretty significant impact for a few months. And then I think it tapered over time as Russia found workarounds that honestly, workarounds is almost a generous term. They just exploited known loopholes to the price cap. It wasn't sort of, anything magic that they pulled off. And so what wound up happening was you kind of had this game of, US and Europe would impose really aggressive sanctions, Russia's economy would take a hit, and then they'd kind of adapt, and then you'd have another this sort of undulating process of pressure and recovery. And I think where we are today, and sort of the hand that Trump has inherited, is one where Russia's economy is not doing very well, which I think you'd expect after 3 years of pretty aggressive sanctions. We can get into more specifics on Russia's economy if you want, but there's a real question of what's the goal of the sanctions right now, especially when it seems like Ukraine is on its back foot on the battlefield. Is there really meaningful pressure that could be increased on Russia right now to maybe bring Putin to the negotiating table? That's something we can discuss. But I think that's sort of where we are, where deterrence failed. The Biden administration tried to maximize the impact of sanctions without touching the core sector of Russia's economy. And they hit a limit in terms of how far they could go. And so I think what Trump has to decide is if he does want to continue using economic pressure, how aggressive is he willing to get on Russia's oil sector?
Thank you so much, Eddie. And Will, let's turn to you now, just how you see the economic statecraft, the role of sanctions, and in a sense, the story of the last couple of years up until November 5, 2024.
Yeah, I mean, look, I actually think we should frame this in a broader context here. I think that's helpful because I don't think, I think when we think about any type of approach to a particular country or particular region in the world, it ought to be within the framework of an overarching, strategic vision. And so I think I'd like to kind of set some of the ground for that in terms of some expectations here. And again, I don't speak for the administration, or President Trump. I'm speaking for myself and my institution. But I am a Republican, and I did support President Trump. And part of the reason I supported President Trump because I think he is approaching foreign policy quite differently than the way we've seen in the past. And I think that is, again, an important context here. So if you think about how the Trump administration appears to be shaping up, and you saw this with both the inaugural address, Secretary Rubio's confirmation hearings, Secretary Hegseth's confirmation hearings, I think you can kind of say something about this context. And one of these is, of course, is that it's a critique of the past, right? It's very much a critique of the establishment and of elites. And I think that that would go towards the critique of those who have been architects of our approach to Russia, for many decades, actually. President, Trump has been highly critical of kind of foreign adventurism that doesn't tier up to supporting America's interests, and that kind of America First approach. You've seen a critique of the liberal world order. In Secretary Rubio's hearings, he talked about it not only being a fantasy, but a dangerous delusion, right, to try to approach the world this way. Very much a kind of a more realist approach to focusing on the national interests, narrowly defined. One of the things that President Trump said is that during every single day of the Trump administration, I will very simply put America first. And that means that some of, I think, these milieu goals or kind of indirect approaches, because again, I'm not sure I think that the establishment oftentimes would say, well, look, we're supporting the national interest too. We have just different theories of the nature of the world and how to indirectly support that. But sometimes it seems to turn into, what was said in the 90s as foreign policy as social work. So it's not clear, sometimes about how much it is altruism and how much it is the national interest, but with a different theory about how to support that. But the fact is I think President Trump and the administration has a very different approach to that. I don't think it's going to have the features of social work that you've seen in the past. And so, again, I like the formulation that Secretary Rubio had, where he talked about, does it make America safer? Does it make America stronger? Does it make America more prosperous? And again, they're not going to define those things in similar ways. And then when it comes to the kind of how that is going to be operationalized in the regions, look, it's pretty clear that the Western Hemisphere and Asia are going to be much more important considerations for this administration. I mean, I think it was a really interesting signal that Secretary Rubio, for example, went to Latin America for his first trip, right? that in President Trump's inaugural address, the Panama Canal got more attention than the Middle East or Europe. And I think that and it doesn't take a rocket scientist to know, that China is considered to be the most important strategic challenge of the coming years, of the coming decades, and that the Trump administration is leaning into that. And then when it comes to Europe, a real emphasis on burden sharing and burden shifting. The problem of free riders. I mean, Secretary Rubio talked about this in his hearings. And a real sense that prudence should be the guide, right? So in military policy, right, a return to the warrior culture, to lethality, a sense of that it's not just what battles we win, as the president said, but what wars we end and what wars we never get into in the first place. That's a very different approach than whatever it takes, or sacred alliances, or any of those kind of rules-based liberal international order approaches or ideas that you saw proliferating in the last 4 years. And I think that means that for Ukraine and for Russia, it means an opportunity for a new approach. Now, again, the challenge, of course, is that reality hits you pretty strongly when you're in office, and you do have a war going on where the United States has made significant commitments. And the view is that the United States has said, or President Trump has said, that the war has to be brought to an end. And that's a goal of the administration, but then the question is of course, how? And Secretary Rubio was very clear to say it's not going to be easy. And there have been, again, I would expect more specifics over time, but I think that context is helpful for understanding how this will be prioritized, how much effort the United States is going to put into this. And again, like, we could talk all day long about the Biden administration's commitment to Ukraine, but very early on, the Biden administration took the use of troops off the table. And that suggested its relative importance, even in the Biden administration's rather kind of interventionist approach to the world, because they took that off the table. A no-fly zone was floated by a lot of folks in Washington and was rejected. And so the United States, even under Biden, was only willing to go so far, despite having, I think, a broader sense of commitment to those larger goals that Ukraine itself wanted out of this conflict. And I would expect that the United States, again, referencing already stated remarks from Secretary Rubio, for example, is not going to have those same types of goals that we saw in terms of saying to to Ukraine that Ukraine whole and free. That just doesn't seem to be the approach that's going to take place here.
Thank you both, Eddie and Will, for very comprehensive remarks to Michael's questions, from Russia's economy because of sanctions to the post-World War II liberal order. So a lot of food for thought. I think Michael and I have been jotting down a lot of notes. I want to actually, Eddie, go back to you and pick up on some of the points you raised and things that I think our audience members might especially be interested. We can talk about, how Russia's economy is doing right now. So if you could talk a little bit about that. You also mentioned what's the goal of sanctions now. So maybe what's the goal and also I want to link, obviously everyone's minds are right now on the tariffs, right? The impending tariffs that are supposed to go into effect vis-a-vis our neighbors, Canada, Mexico, and China as well. So how might, to the extent you can link that in, how might a tariff war, either positively or negatively enable Russia's economy to rebound?
Yeah, sure. All good questions, and I'll try to answer all of them. But if I forget to any of your points, please call me out, because I want to make sure I get to all of them. So yeah, on Russia's economy, I think there's been an interesting media narrative. Like, if you sort of trace the trajectory over the last 3 years, from the start of the sanctions to today, which was initially it was Russia's economy is like gone, right? As we're going to contract by 15%. This was what a lot of the analyst forecasts said in March of 2022, which would have been, really like on par with what you see in like a civil war torn, country like Syria, right? It's not, for instance, we never saw Iran's economy contract by 15% because of sanctions. So this would have been dramatic. That was what, credible economists, banks were predicting in March of 2022. You saw the beginnings of a nationwide bank run where, you had people lining up at ATM lines all across the country. The main Russian stock market, the MOEX, was closed for an entire month, basically the full month of March. So there was a really dramatic crisis that happened. But then, over the course of 2022, the narrative kind of shifted, which was, oh, well, hold on a second. Russia's economy is not doing that bad. It wound up contracting by 2 or 3% in 2022. It wasn't even close to the 10 or 15% that was initially projected. And then, of course, the next year in 2023, and then again in 2024, Russia's economy has been growing around 3% a year. And that's largely on the backs of what I would call military Keynesianism. Effectively, turning military production and troops, into a giant stimulus package. So the entire Russian economy has been buoyed by unprecedented spending on security. And so the narrative shifted, which is, oh, well, Russia's fine. The sanctions are useless. I think what you started to see in the last few months is people are like, oh, wait, hold on a second. Russia's economy is not fine, right? You had interest rates right now that the official benchmark interest rates at 21%. I think Russians are getting home mortgages around 30%. Effectively, it's impossible right now to make any sustainable business investment in Russia as a Russian, because you're better off just putting your money in a bank and getting whatever 21 or 25% interest you're generating just on deposits. And the Russian economy right now is probably going to grow at either 0.5%, I think, is what the Central Bank of Russia predicted this year. But I think a lot of people think you might even have a recession that occurs this year, despite this really high level of military spending. And the other thing too that's interesting, and I'd be curious if Michael has read anything into this, but you've also started to see some real fissures within the Russian elite over economic management. Sort of the macroeconomic policy has been one of the few areas of the Russian state that's been retained in the hands of professional managers like Elvira Nabiullina, the head of the Central Bank of Russia, someone who's quite well respected around the world. And you've seen very important Russian businessmen who basically called for her to be removed, or called for the Russian state to take a much greater role in setting central bank policy. So that's something that gets my antenna up as someone who's who follows Russian issues. So I think the consensus now is that Russia is sort of on the ropes. That maybe if Ukraine could survive another 2 years, you really could potentially push Russia into a very significant economic crisis that might be enough for Putin to say, it's time to make a deal to try to get sanctions relief. So in some ways, we've come full circle in that there is a plausible way, I think, to potentially use economic pressure now as a bargaining chip, basically to try to get Russia to the table. And we've already seen President Trump do that, right? I mean, he hasn't said very much personally about Russia. The one thing I think he said in a big way since coming to office was putting out a social media post in which he effectively told Putin, you can do this the easy way or the hard way. But in terms of making a deal, the hard way being very high levels of taxes, tariffs, and sanctions. We don't really import very much for Russia, so tariffs I don't think is relevant. But there is a lot more that could be done on the sanctions front to probably push, accelerate that timeline to Russia's economic reckoning, maybe from 2 years to 6 months or something like that. And we can talk about how that intersects with other policies of the Trump administration, like energy dominance and asking the Saudis to bring down oil prices. There's interconnections between all of this, and I think some of it contradicts each other. And so Trump will have to decide what he prioritizes. In terms of the tariffs, because I think it's a very important question, how does this affect the war in Ukraine? I think in the most immediate sense, it does not do very good things, I think, for the US policy toward Russia for a few reasons. One is that it is showing that Trump's number one priority, really, in terms of sort of using coercive economic measures against anyone, is against American allies, right? Against Canada, who's been a stalwart sort of G7 ally for the US in the war on Ukraine, has been very important in terms of aid to Ukraine as well as support for sanctions measures, and of course picking a fight with our southern neighbor Mexico. And I think there's almost the sheer rates of the tariffs tell it all. Where you put a 10% incremental tariff on China, but 25% on Canada and Mexico. I think the signal that Trump is sending is I'm penalizing my friends more than my enemies. And so I think that's not a particularly good signal if you're someone who cares about trying to get an expedited end to the war in Ukraine. I think an irony here, and something that honestly personally concerns me, and something that will become more relevant if this tariff war is prolonged. I think that's a big if. We'll see if it sounds like Trump is going to be talking to Justin Trudeau and Claudia Sheinbaum sometime today. So there's still maybe some sliver of a hope that there's a 11th hour deal. But let's say these tariffs stay in place. The Canadian election that's about to come up is effectively becoming a contest over who can craft the most effective counterpunch against the United States. I'm not worried particularly about, Canada is a much smaller economy than the US, and so it's not that the US economy is in grave danger or something. But I think there's some irony in the fact that Chrystia Freeland, who actually is one of the key architects of the Russia sanctions with the G7 in 2022, is now one of the people putting out creative proposals in terms of how to sanction America, right? Including putting tariffs on Tesla and targeting Elon Musk, for instance. We've seen, I think, Ontario canceled a big contract for Starlink today. So we're starting to see some of these targeted sanctions and more sort of sophisticated economic measures that could actually be directed against the United States if we start, imposing tariff wars against our allies.
Oh, thank you, Eddie. Will, if I could turn over similar types of questions to you, maybe you brought up looking through a realist perspective. So how might the introduction of tariffs against, China, Mexico, Canada impact the U.S. economy and impact our ability, or more broadly, our European allies, the ability to kind of contain Russia's economy negatively?
Yeah, I mean, one question again that I want to get into here is the question of who has a kind of escalation dominance in in these struggles, and the United States, vis-a-vis Canada, I think clearly has that, and I would expect that despite a lot of the kind of bluster that you're seeing from Canada and some of the things that you just heard, is that there'll be attempts to at conciliation because of that escalation dominance. You mentioned the comparative size of the two economies. Clearly, while Canada is an important trading partner to the United States, we're a much more important trading partner to them. Now, on the issue of Russia, I'm not sure I agree with fully with what we just heard in terms of the kind of status of the war. I mean, clearly Russia's economy is suffering. It's good to hear someone talk about how military Keynesianism isn't all that effective at creating economic growth. It's something that I've believed my entire life, which is why I'm not a big fan of government spending as opposed to private sector investment. So it's good to hear that. And we have heard, people talking about military Keynesianism in relation to the war in Ukraine in the United States, saying that this was good for the American economy. So if it's not good for Russia's economy, I'm not sure it's going to be great for the American economy either. Especially if it's not connected to those three things Secretary Rubio talked about: making us more secure, making us stronger, making us more prosperous. And so that's an argument that goes out the window, I suppose, for why billions of dollars being sent to Ukraine are necessarily good for the United States. What I would say on this is that, look, is Russia really on the ropes, as you just heard? Is it a case in which, if Ukraine can only hold out for 2 more years, that Ukraine will actually be in a better position than it is today? I'm not convinced of that. It seems like, and you've heard, people talking about the problem isn't so much equipment or aid, it's manpower. I mean, Ukraine has real manpower problems, especially if it's not willing to change some of its manpower policies, and I understand why they're reluctant to do that. But it seems like Russia, while not being in the position that it would like, is clearly I think is clearly not on the ropes. And I don't celebrate that by any means. I am clearly not excited about Russia achieving its goals in Ukraine. It's the Putin regime is one that I have considerable or share the considerable disdain that all of us in the West have in terms of its behaviors. But it does have a significant interest in Ukraine. It's why it went to war in the first place. I think that the question of NATO's status in the future and of the issue of the open door is something that is going to have to be, I think, discussed because again. It's not a case in these engagements where we're simply going to be able to put pressure on Russia and Russia will simply cry uncle, right? I just don't think that that's the case, given its interests. And again, that goes back to, I think, that realist framework is not looking at the ideal, not thinking that we're going to be able to get anything we want. I think it's going to be a case in which you're going to have to see, I think, careful understanding of what we want out of this as we push through an attempt to end the conflict. Because we're not going to be able to get everything. And so the question is how do you prioritize those things? And, I would say that, the status of Crimea, for example, the status of kind of land concessions, those are going to have to be considered vis-a-vis other things that the United States cares about or the West cares about. And that's going to be very challenging because there hasn't been as much realistic, I think, thinking about that, since the conflict began.
Great, thank you so much, Eddie and Will. I want to focus in on one specific matter, which I think emerged in both of your sets of comments, and I'm delighted to see that we have a lot of questions and already in our Q&A function. But for audience members who wish to add additional ones, please do so now, and we'll turn to those questions not far from now. Eddie, you mentioned the comment from President Trump about driving oil prices lower as a means of putting pressure on Russia. Let me start first with you, Will, and then have Eddie come in. Will, what do you see the role of coercive economic statecraft, vis-a-vis Russia and Ukraine? It's clear from the second inaugural address of President Trump and from the first few weeks that President Trump is very comfortable with coercive economic statecraft, or forward-leaning economic statecraft. Sort of plug in the adjective of choice, but he's comfortable using that tool. How do you think he could, should, or might use that tool in the case of sort of achieving progress in negotiations or bringing the war to an end?
Yeah, I mean, again, Eddie referenced what President Trump had already said this week on that, and so I think that there is a willingness to use economic statecraft in a way to advance other goals. I mean, that's across the board. I mean, you see the threat of or the imposition of tariffs linked to other issues outside of the economic realm, like border security, like the issue of drugs, and so I think they're willing for sure. And look, I think that this is smart, right? When you're trying to craft an approach to the world, you have to think about your kind of three major tools in your toolkit, right? So obviously your military power, the tools of economic statecraft and diplomacy. And, if you're very careful about trying to, when you use military power, which I think this administration has clearly signaled it's going to be, then economic statecraft, I think, moves further ahead in the toolbox to pull out and try to utilize to meet your objectives. So I'm not surprised to see this, particularly given a desire, I think, to use, to kind of rebuild our military, and B, to have that focused where it is most needed, which I think is in the Indo-Pacific. And so it's not surprising you'd see that, especially given the president's views on the utility of tariffs actually for rebuilding the American economy. So perhaps the sense that all good things go together here.
Great, thank you so much, Will. And Eddie, let me ask you a slightly different, though related, question. If you were called upon by the Trump White House to offer a suite of suggestions when it came to enhancing economic statecraft without having to adjudicate what the goals would be in negotiations or war termination or gaining advantage in the war, what 2 or 3 policies would you highlight at the moment? Where do you think, Will mentioned priorities and the importance of priorities. Where would you lay those priorities down at the present moment for the Trump administration, obviously with an eye to Russia and Ukraine and not to other theaters.
Yeah, sure. So, on January 10th, so 10 days before Biden left office, his administration imposed a new suite of sanctions on Russia, which for the first time actually targeted Russian oil companies directly. So Gazprom Neft, which is the third largest oil producer in Russia, and Circuit Neft Gas, which is the fourth largest oil producer in Russia, were both hit with direct sanctions, which was a really significant move that we'd not seen any direct sanctions on any major Russian oil or gas companies up until that point. We also saw a suite of other measures directly targeted at Russian oil production and sales. So in some ways, in the very end of the Biden administration, on his way out the door, Biden reversed the policy that I sort of started by talking about in my remarks, which was he went directly at the heart of Russia's economy. And you could argue that maybe this is because he didn't care as much about inflation anymore because it's not his problem. What I think folks in the Biden administration would say is inflation has come down, which is objectively true, and that oil markets are much more well supplied, and the outlook for prices is generally bearish. So there's more sort of flexibility from an American sort of economic interest standpoint in potentially taking as much as 2 million barrels of Russian oil off the market. And just for to level set on data, Russia exports 5 million barrels of crude oil and another 2.5 million barrels of petroleum products each day. And I think estimates are that the final sort of shot that the Biden administration took could take anywhere from 500,000 to 2 million barrels of Russian oil off the market in the medium term. So far, it's looking like the lower end of that range, but we won't really know until early March, which is when the grace period ends. So what could Trump do? Obviously, the core question is, should we tighten the screws on Russia, right? You could argue maybe we shouldn't. My own view is if you want to get a deal, for a lot of the reasons, frankly, that Will mentioned, which is that Ukraine does have very serious manpower issues. It's not clear how long Ukraine really could go on fighting. You want to get as much leverage over Putin as quickly as possible. And so I think that the time is right for a much more aggressive suite of sanctions on Russia's energy sector. We have not seen, for instance, sanctions on Rosneft, the largest oil company in Russia. We have not seen sanctions on Lukoil, the second largest oil company in Russia, nor have we seen sanctions on Gazprom or Novatek, which are the two largest natural gas companies in Russia. I think if the Trump administration were willing to go ahead and impose blocking sanctions on those companies, you probably would see significant Russian oil come off the market. You'd see a temporary spike in prices. But if what Trump really wants is for Saudi to pump more oil and for shale producers in the United States also to get to pump more oil, the only way to do that is for a market incentive. And I think a temporary price spike that encourages Saudi to pump more oil, that encourages American shale to pump and export more oil, would not only, I think, achieve some of his energy security goals that he's laid out very clearly, but also drive a very serious blow to Russia's economy. So I think that if I were advising the Trump administration, understanding their goals, which is to try to get a quick end to the war in Ukraine, and also to increase American energy security and increase sort of American production of fossil fuels, that would be my recommendation. And I think it's on the table. I don't think he will succeed. By the way, I think what Trump is trying to do now is to work this all out through negotiations and cut a deal with the Saudis where the Saudis agree to pump more oil and then maybe they take steps on Russia. That's not going to work. The Saudis aren't going to play ball. But I think if he's willing to take a little bit of risk, which, by the way, I think he probably might be, given that he's about to impose 25% across the board tariffs on our two largest trading partners, which shows that he is willing to take some pretty serious risks when it comes to the American economy. That would be my recommendation. Would that work in terms of getting Putin to the table? Anyone's guess is as good as mine. But I am very confident that it would significantly turn up the economic pressure in Russia, would force Russia into very serious recession this year, and would give Putin a non-military reason to try to seek a deal, which currently I don't think he really has, at least at the time scale that Trump wants.
Yeah, and so can I jump in here? Yeah, I mean, I think this is why we have to be very careful in terms of how we prioritize goals for Ukraine vis-a-vis goals for the United States, going back to this issue of stronger, more secure, more prosperous. Because we don't want to necessarily risk the American economy by energy spikes that would harm the economy, especially at the beginning of an administration that would, has promised a revival of America's economy from some of the doldrums that we've had. I don't think that we have to be careful again, because it's not exactly a unpredictable consequence, as you mentioned. Meanwhile, and the thing that would actually give us more flexibility here would be our own internal unleashing of our energy markets, and I think you've seen that with Secretary nominee Wright, this desire to actually expand what we're doing domestically. That's going to be a way in which that could help, create a situation in which we aren't as reliant on our diplomacy to get Saudi Arabia to pump more oil. I mean, of course, that would be useful here, but the fact is that I do think that the economic priorities of us here at home, trump anything. Any goal, period, in Ukraine, given what we've seen before in terms of the prioritization. I mean, it's not difficult to hear that inaugural, to read that inaugural, and see domestic policies being privileged over the interests of foreign actors here. And again, Ukraine policy doesn't take place in a vacuum. It's not just a vacuum of our foreign policy goals. It's also all of the goals that we have, including those domestic goals that are higher priority, I think. And so I would want to be very careful in terms of privileging policy towards Ukraine in a way that would have a deleterious potential effect on the most important thing, which I think is American strength and American prosperity.
Michael, could I just two-finger? I'd love to jump in just real quick here. Is that
Of course, yeah, and then we'll turn to audience questions.
Yeah, I just want.
Of course.
To be clear, Will, I don't think what I'm saying here is I don't think that you're going to achieve Trump's goals on energy dominance just by a couple of deregulatory measures. Shale in the U.S. is not profitable at lower oil prices. And so the question is, where are they going to get that market share from? Where are they going to get an economic incentive? It's supply and demand. And I think if Trump actually wants that, if Trump actually wants more American fossil fuel production, there needs to be a price signal. And so the question is, where's that price signal coming from? We can project what demand is going to be. So it has to be taking some supply off the market. So I do think that what I'm arguing is that you could take some Russian supply off the market and help Trump achieve his goal of energy dominance. I think if you don't take Russian supply off the market, I don't see how Trump boosts oil production. And frankly, even oil executives themselves don't believe that there's going to be increased oil production absent a strong price signal.
And again, I think lower energy costs are the key. And so I think that's going to be something that would be, higher energy costs are not something necessarily desirable, simply to for, what you were saying in terms of the kind of source of that. I mean, there are far more consumers than there are producers. And I think those are the people that vote, right?
I want to thank you both. I'm going to jump in and switch over to audience questions just because we have a number of excellent questions that have come in. Just as a reminder for our audience, please do feel free to keep sending your questions. We have about 15 minutes. And as a reminder, please include your name and affiliation when you send them. So these questions, Eddie, Will, they're directed at both of you. So either of you feel free to jump in. The first one we have from Margarita Balmaceda, Professor of International Relations and Diplomacy at Seton Hall. She asks, looking back at the period 2014 to 2021, we see a tendency to not see the real impact of Russia's invasion on Ukraine and annexation of its territory in the spring of 2014. Many see the lack of real responses at this time as incentivizing the Russian leadership to become even bolder in its expansionist aims vis-a-vis Ukraine. Is it possible that Trump 2.0 policies vis-a-vis the Russo-Ukrainian war may lead to similar developments?
I'm happy to give my own thoughts, and Will may have some too. First of all, Margarita, I agree with your assessment. I think that going back, if you look back sort of at the history from 2014 to 2021, I think the first error that the West made was after sort of the February 2015 Minsk II agreement, which was they sort of settled for an uneasy stalemate that Russia clearly wasn't intent on implementing and giving Ukraine back sovereignty over territories in the Donbass. in exchange, although this was never expressly laid out, for putting your foot on the brake on sanctions. And so we didn't really see any meaningful increase in economic pressure after February 2015. And this even persisted throughout very public accusations of Russia interfering in the 2016 US election. You didn't see a strong response from the Obama administration. You didn't see any really meaningful Russia sanctions by the Trump administration. The one time they did impose sanctions on Russia, which was under significant political pressure in April of 2018, they sanctioned an aluminum company called Rusal and then waived the sanctions a couple days later once they got complaints from American companies. So I do think that the history of this from the sort of latter years of the Obama administration through all 4 years of Trump, the lesson Putin took was, okay, I suffered a year of economic pain because of the annexation of Crimea, but then it sort of blew over. And so I do think that that's a really challenging, it was really challenging for the West to regain credibility after that. So I do worry that were Trump to sort of give Ukraine or give Russia a free pass and say, you know what, we're done with these sanctions, feel free to have at it in Ukraine, that would be really dangerous. And I think you'd be very concerned about who's sort of next on the chopping block for Putin. I personally am a little bit heartened by the fact that Trump did put out that True Social post threatening basically high levels of tariffs, sanctions, and taxes on Russia if they didn't seek a deal. Because that to me suggested that's something we'd never heard out of the first Trump administration. We never heard any threats against Putin in the first Trump administration. So I think that the early signs are somewhat encouraging on the fact that Russia is not just going to get a free pass, but we'll have to see what happens when the rubber hits the road.
Will, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think I just look at the world, very differently in terms of the kind of expected behaviors and the causal forces that are moving countries. I think that that there's not a kind of, if you will, kind of a seamless web of interests or a kind of that any tear in the kind of nature of the international system is necessarily going to spread throughout the kind of sheet, if you will. I think that Russia's interests in Ukraine and our interests in Ukraine are very different than the kind of balance of interests when it comes to our NATO allies and other partners. It's just a different circumstance, and so I don't buy the kind of like if he eats this, what's next on the plate. Especially again because our interests are different, and therefore the tools that we'd be willing to use are quite different. And so I'm not as pessimistic there. And again, the other thing is that there is a kind of there would be a reaction. I mean, I would expect, as we've seen already, some increased European efforts in response to the initial invasion of Ukraine. And I think that if there were further Russian movement, you would see even more of that, which would, I think, actually be in America's interest to see that European response. I would like to see the Europeans step up even more when it comes to actual tip of the spear capabilities in terms of burden sharing. And then also this issue about the kind of future of NATO. I mean, I think that the United States is not responsible, obviously, and the West is not responsible for the invasion of Ukraine, but it's a very complicated story. And part of that story is, I think that that there was a case of a security dilemma here, and I think that poor diplomatic and military signals were sent vis-a-vis this relationship. And I think that undermined actually European security. And so I think that's, obviously we have to be careful with kind of, the kind of nuance of that type of argument. But that's also one of the reasons why I think that in any negotiation over Ukraine, that we should be open to thinking about the type of security architecture that would provide for Ukrainian security in a way that would not necessarily stimulate future problems vis-a-vis the security dilemma.
Wonderful. Thank you both. In the interests of time, I think it may make sense. We'll sort of see if we can squeeze in one further question, but it may make sense to ask this question as something of our concluding question, and you could weave into it, any concluding thoughts or remarks you have about the conversation at large. And this is a question from Dietrich Reitz, about sanctions policy, and I'll ask it first to Eddie, and then I'll tack on something a little bit extra and different for Will. But it's a useful question because it goes against the grain, Eddie, of something that you were saying before about the efficacy of sanctions and difficulties that these sanctions are building for the Russian economy. This is a question about sanctions as a stimulus to the Russian economy, and whether this has in fact stimulated, against expectations, stimulated the Russian defense sector. So I'll start there with you, Eddie. It's really a question about, of course, the efficacy of sanctions. So my guess is that you'll have a lot to say about that.
Sure, yeah. And sorry, the question is, have sanctions stimulated the Russian defense sector?
Right, and the Russian economy in certain ways, I guess, if there's a kind of counterproductive undertow to sanctions.
Yeah, sure. Sanctions definitely have unintended consequences. And I think, they're one of them in this case, and maybe unintended is too strong a word. I think it's maybe undesirable consequences, because you know that they're going to happen, is you incentivize a degree of autarky, right? And so what you have done through these sanctions is you've encouraged Russia to onshore various production chains that they didn't have, to diversify relationships away from Europe and away from the United States toward the West, or toward China rather. And you've seen Russian bilateral trade with China double since the start of the war. I think it's now around $250 billion in bilateral trade, which is really significant, right? I mean, it's like half of the U.S.-China trade relationship. So it's a pretty significant amount between Russia and China. Those are clearly undesirable outcomes. I think the question you have to ask as a policymaker is, what is the alternative, right? And let's do a counterfactual. Let's say there are no sanctions, right? Would Russia's economy be better or worse off? Almost certainly much, much better off, because you would have had all the same defense spending that you've seen, plus access to things like cutting-edge semiconductors and other equipment from the West, and financing that they can't get anymore. Significantly more energy production in Russia. So yes, Russia's economy would be significantly better off without sanctions. And frankly, they'd be better off without the 2014 sanctions too, right? And this has been now a story that's gone on for almost a decade. And I think that's one of the challenges that is honestly afflicting American policy overall right now, which is a lot of the sort of architecture of the modern global economy was built on the premise that it was win-win. And, open trade and financial relationships with Russia or China would be good for both sides. And I think that calculus has changed. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, even setting aside whether you're using sanctions as negotiating leverage or trying to change the calculus of Putin or Xi Jinping, is, do we want these countries' economies and thereby their technological and military industrial complexes to benefit from Silicon Valley technology, Wall Street financing, and sort of the best expertise from the West? And I think it's really hard to make the case that we do. And that's the reason why, going back to the Cold War, we did not have economic interdependence between the United States and the Soviet Union. And so it's an uncomfortable transition that we're going through from one of win-win to more of a zero-sum economic relationship with Russia, and with China, something that's more ambiguous between positive sum in some areas and zero sum in others, which is a very, very hard balance to strike. But I think overall, that's sort of the macro situation that we're in right now.
Wonderful. And Eddie, it's very nice to sort of conclude your comments on such a philosophical note. And in that vein, I want to ask a somewhat broader question, based on the one that came in the Q&A of Will, maybe a very broad question. And this is that in the Biden administration, we heard a little bit about tariffs and a lot about sanctions. So far, the Trump administration, granted, only a few weeks old, we haven't heard too much about sanctions here and there, but we certainly heard a lot about tariffs. Do you have a explanation for this, or is there a way that you can help us to understand what does seem like one of the bigger transitions from one administration to the other?
I mean, again, my answer is going to be really a question, which is the $64,000 question, which is how much of this is a commitment to a more mercantilist philosophical approach to global trade, or how much is it that it's 5D chess and it's about the kind of leverage you gain in terms of cutting better trade deals, of issue linkages, like I just talked about, and using economic statecraft for those non-economic goals. So I think that's answering that question is going to be really interesting to see over the next 4 years. And it could be a little bit of a combination of both, right? It could be a sense that it's a very different philosophical view about the nature of trade, but it is an autarchism, right? It isn't a desire for the United States to to reject the economic engagement with the world. It's just trying to reset the terms of the economic engagement in a way that for President Trump, he believes America has won. And I think that and they're also, again, we in a way we also have to kind of disaggregate the state, not to sound too much like a political scientist here, right? Is that there are cutting currents in any administration. There certainly was in the Biden administration, and there certainly are in a Republican administration. And so, obviously the concerns about a healthy, robust economy and how Wall Street is doing, and kind of the the currents that would come from that part of the Republican Party are also going to be. There's also other, kind of currents. And again, we don't necessarily have to linger on personnel, but you have more traditional free market people, and you have, people that are, more Pat Buchanan than they are Milton Friedman. And I think that, President Trump is going to be is the kind of keystone of that, and will make that determination. But again, I have a hard time believing that it's that it's. I think that winning is the goal here, and the question is, and then I would say winning is probably related to a sense that the American economy is doing well, and that's going to require some engagement in terms of trade, and then a reshaping of the trade terms. So, for example, when it comes to Europe, I think that there's a sense in the Republican circles, conservative circles, that relationship needs to be reset in a variety of different ways, and that Europe has to conciliate the United States when it comes to both the military side and the economic side, because that relationship has been perceived as being unfair. And I would actually, go out on a limb here, not that much of a limb if you know me, and say it's not just a perception that it's unfair. The relationship has been unfair. Europe has been free riding and has been able to take advantage of the United States in a number of ways. And I think that means resetting that relationship. Again, that doesn't mean there has to be a adversarial relationship. It just means that the relationship of these partners can be reset in a way that rebalances what I think has been a flawed balance in the past. And again, that's why you see a concern about pushing on a kind of negotiation of the military relationship in terms of burden sharing and burden shifting, but also a rethinking about the way in which Europe can do business with the United States. And I think that's going to be important ahead for transatlantic relations.
Wonderful. A very winning approach to time management in this conversation. We're exactly where we should be. I would like to thank Lenny Lapato and the Kennan Institute staff for putting this event together. My colleague Jennifer Wistrand for joining in the moderation of this conversation. But most of all, I'd like to thank the two of you, Eddie and Will, for a really stimulating and rich conversation about economic statecraft, the war in Ukraine, and a transition from one presidential administration to another. I hope that you will be back in the future to join us for other conversations about these these crucial topics. And for our audience, you should know that, sort of both Eddie and Will are prolific authors of many different kinds of pieces, but I'll give yet another shout out, Eddie, to your forthcoming book, Choke Points, which addresses a lot of the issues that were covered in this conversation. So thank you so much to everyone. Thank you for tuning in, and see you soon, I'm sure, for a similar kind of conversation in the future.
Thank you.
Thanks.